Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Cash. I'm the Dean of the John W. McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies here at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. It is a pleasure to have this conversation today, incredibly timely as we are heading into the election season, where questions of truth and fake news and intelligence and fact and evidence are all part of the debates that we're having today. And it's a fantastic set of folks we have to talk with us today. Robert Draper who writes for the New York Times had a fantastic article a couple of weeks ago that looked at intelligence in the Trump administration. And Margaret Henoch, who for almost 2.5 decades was the Directorate of Operations at the CIA. She'll talk a little bit about that. And we're going to spend by far the bulk of the time talking with them. They're going to speak with one another, and then we'll be opening up to questions and answers. Let me give a small bit of background, and one is just in truth in advertising. About a month and a half ago, my brother, Stephen Cash, who had been a CIA officer, also had been counsel on Capitol Hill for a number of legislative leaders looking at national security issues, approached me and asked if UMass Boston and the McCormack Graduate School might want to host this conversation, and totally jumped at it because it's so timely right now. Steve is a member of the Steady State. It's a relatively new group of 200 plus former government officials who've served in the US national security and homeland security communities, both people who would call themselves Democrats, Republicans, independents, none of the above, people who've been in the CIA and defense and foreign service, congressional staffers, all of whom have raised concerns about how intelligence has or has not been used in the Trump presidency. They've come out formally to support Vice President Biden, which is extraordinarily rare in this community, and I've been speaking about these kinds of concerns. And right before we launch into this, I want to make a kind of fun connection. You heard me say that I'm the Dean of the John W. McCormack Graduate School. John W. McCormack was a longtime lawmaker in Massachusetts, grew up in poverty, made his way into the state legislature and then the US Congress. In fact, he was the last person to get to become an official attorney without taking the bar exam in Massachusetts. He was totally self-taught, didn't go to college. And he was one of the most influential lawmakers over a series of decades, but was incredibly humble. Many people have not heard of him. He worked supporting the agendas in the FDR administration, Truman administration, LBJ, Kennedy, and was Speaker of the House in the 60s. But was also for many, many years the majority leader, and was the majority leader under Sam Rayburn, the very famous Speaker of the House for many years. And in fact, he was one of the leadership in Congress that helped pass the National Security Act of 1947, which created the CIA, among many other things. And it was a very complicated bill, took a lot of negotiation and compromise, which John W. McCormack was a master at, figuring out how to get to a resolution of complicated problems by bringing the right people on board. So there's a nice connection, Robert and Margaret, to John W. McCormack, our namesake, and the Central Intelligence Agency and the whole security apparatus. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Margaret and Robert. But first, I'm going to thank the team here who've done a phenomenal job. Rochelle Straker, Jack Lee have been fantastic making sure this is all working correctly. You will have opportunities, you in the audience, to answer questions. You just click on the Q&A, and we'll be going through those throughout. Margaret and Robert are going to speak for the next 20 minutes to a half hour, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So with that, why don't I turn it over to Margaret and Robert. Thank you so much.
Robert, you were going to start with the sort of encapsulated description of what the article is.
Sure, yeah. That's hey everyone, I'm Robert Draper. I'm a writer with the New York Times Magazine, and for what it's worth, Margaret and I got to know each other during the course of my reporting for a book that was recently published of mine about the run-up to the Iraq War, called "To Start a War: How the Bush Administration Took America into Iraq." Margaret, and we will likely get into this, was figures particularly into the sub-saga of the greater saga of the intelligence failures, relating to the biological weapons source known infamously as Curveball. So we spoke extensively on that subject and got to know each other as a result. The story that Margaret's referring to is a story that I wrote that came out a few weeks ago in the New York Times Magazine, and it was a story that took me about 5 months to do. It was about the relationship, I should say the rather fraught relationship, between President Trump and his intelligence community. And what gave rise to it was that, as all of us know, that this is a president who has a precarious grasp on the facts, who has never been shy about promulgating what his counselor in the White House, Kellyanne Conway, memorably termed alternative facts. And so I wondered what that was like then for those people whose job it is to deliver ground truth, as unpleasant as it may often be. People within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, et cetera. And the short version of the story is that relationship is fraught, to say the least. And I delve particularly into a top secret document that I came to learn about, a national intelligence estimate that was essentially doctored to avoid political embarrassment to the president. This is the kind of thing that simply does not happen in the intelligence community, and is a signal, a warning signal, I should say, of just how the international community has been, like so many other government agencies under the Trump administration, brought to heel, which would be particularly worrisome in any agency, but particularly, again, the one that's supposed to be providing reality. And if the president is not liking the reality and is essentially ordering it to be changed into some reality that he prefers, but that is not really the reality as we know it, then obviously we have problems, and the story discusses those in detail. So that's the thumbnail sketch, I guess.
Thank you. I was just going, since you just answered my first question, I'm going to ask you a couple questions about the NIE, which is a little bit inside baseball, but I think it probably matters to people who don't know, have my background.
Well, hold on a second. One rule here: no acronyms,
no initials,
without defining them.
Yeah.
National intelligence estimate.
And the national intelligence estimate for the rest of you guys is that is meant to be, it's always a top secret document that is the consensus product of the 17 agencies that comprise the intelligence community. It's essentially them getting together on a particular subject, comparing notes, as it were, their own opinions, their own raw intelligence, and saying, here's what we, the community, believe. The most infamous example of the NIEs is one Margaret's familiar with, the National Intelligence Estimate that related to Iraq's supposed weapons of mass destruction, which was used as the basis in October 2002 to guide Congress to its vote ultimately to authorize President Bush to use military force in Iraq. And of course, that NIE turned out to be almost completely wrong. But there have been others that have been very, very important, relating to the fragile economy of the Soviet Union, for example, about relating to the Cuban Missile Crisis, relating to North Korea's nuclear capacity. So it's an extremely important document, and that's what we're referring to. So go ahead, Margaret.
Thank you. I was going to talk to you about the honest conflict between analysts when an NIE is being written. Can you sort of go through how that is resolved, what kind of conflict that might be, and then we'll ask the politicization question after that.
Yeah, sure. Because, I mean, with a national intelligence estimate, and for one thing, the word estimate is important, right? It's not only because they tend to be estimated, which means that they're talking about what's likely going to happen in the future, but it's also estimated in the sense that we often don't know things. I mean, it's what the intelligence community does instead is assess things, and these days as a result of the Iraq debacle, they are assigning confidence levels to those assessments from low to moderate to high confidence. And so they're basically saying, look, we don't have stone cold evidence. We don't have a picture of this nuclear weapon, but we do have strong circumstantial evidence. We do have these sources. Analysts, however, can disagree about this kind of stuff, as you're alluding to, Margaret. I mean, and to take, say, the infamous Iraq episode as a case in point, there were certainly analysts who believed that Saddam had a weapons stockpile right then and there. There were others who didn't believe that, but figured that that he was well on his way to achieving it. The others still who didn't know what to believe and just simply were assigning a kind of confidence level to their own assessment. And this is what kind of gets wrangled out in the making of a national intelligence estimate. Ultimately, it's basically we've all gotten together and finally, here's what our consensus opinion is. Now, occasionally there will be one who disagrees and they will provide a scope note or a dissent note in which they basically say, you know, the Department of Energy, for example, in the infamous case of the aluminum tubes that so many in the intelligence community believed were going to be used for nuclear centrifuges in Iraq, the Department of Energy had believed, as did the State Department's own intelligence bureau, that they were more likely used for rocket launchers, and they were permitted to write a dissent for that. But by and large, an NIE is basically everybody getting together and figuring it out.
And they resolve the conflict through discussion, through, I'm not sure, Robert, how to ask the question more sort of.
Yeah. No,
but it's not unusual.
Yeah, generally speaking, a national intelligence estimate takes 6 months, sometimes a year to do. Unfortunately, going back again to the Iraq WMD one, it took they were only given 19 days. They wanted to get it to Congress before the midterm elections, and between the time that Congress just resumed session in the beginning of September and the time they all broke to do their campaigns, 19 days was ridiculous, and just simply didn't provide enough time. Usually it really does take months and months and months. In the case of the NIE that formed the basis of the story that we're talking about, it took about 6 months, 17 agencies going back and forth, looking at the raw intelligence they have, the most current stuff, comparing it to some of the other stuff, looking at the sourcing, and haggling it all out.
If I can just for a second switch topics to away from the National Intelligence Estimate to sort of the CIA, just for a quick from me, I'm not closely familiar with the inner workings of every other agency, but I am pretty familiar with the agency, and there is a lot of misinformation, misunderstanding of what goes on there. So if I could have about a minute, the two directorates that I think Robert and I are probably going to talk about most are the Operations Directorate, which is where I come from, and then the Analytic Directorate, which is where the analysts obviously come from. And one collects the information, that's the Operations Directorate, one then analyzes it. It is nothing like television, it's nothing like the movies. Very few people actually look like Sean Connery. We'll go on like that. I think, Robert, you would agree?
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, you're right. I mean, when people talk about the CIA, they talk about spies. When they're talking about spies, what they're really talking about are case officers. And case officers are in the Directorate of Operations, which Margaret, you worked in, and they're sort of out in the field, and they're developing sources, and they're collecting information. And when they collect this information, they send it back to be analyzed, and the analysts sort of put it in context. Now, it's kind of a famous feud, rivalry, put it however you will, between the DO, Directorate of Operations, and what was once the Directorate of Intelligence, now the Directorate of Analysis, the DA. The DA thinks that these case officers are all a bunch of cowboys, cocky and frankly not very smart. The people from the case officers and others in the director of operation, by turn, think that the analysts, are a bunch of eggheads who are sitting behind your desks in Langley, Virginia, and who really don't understand the real world, don't understand what the sources is. And these kinds of fights come into play as they did in the curveball saga, which we can get into later. But anyway, yeah, those are the two. That's how the baby is divided.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of say that, and that it's nothing like what you've seen in the movies. Back to the NIE and intelligence. Can you talk a little bit about the politicization of intelligence, both the one in the article and, if you want to, the Iraq stuff?
Yeah, sure. So let me talk about this broadly, and then I'll talk about it with specific reference to this NIE that we haven't yet fully described the contents of. In the case of the Iraq War, it's often been said, that the intelligence was politicized, and there are certain people who bristle at that, not without cause, because that would lead you to believe that basically, and the bumper sticker version of the Iraq War is Bush lied, people died, that Bush and the director of the CIA at the time, George Tenet, got in a room and cooked up a bunch of phony intel. And it's far more complicated than that, and no intel per se was cooked up. The real problem, I think, was, though there were a lot of intelligence that turned out to be wrong, the real problem was that the president of the United States ultimately didn't care much about the intelligence, or wasn't guided by it. He was guided by his gut. And his gut was that Saddam's an evil person. He's got weapons of mass destruction because he's an evil guy. He's going to give it to other evil guys like Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has already shown they want to kill us. Now they'll really kill us with WMD that Saddam provided for them. And there was no intelligence whatsoever to buttress any of those kinds of speculations. But that's, the concern is always, the job, as I described in the story, and is that the CIA analysts, and often the director, will go in and they'll brief the president in the Oval Office. They will give what's called the president's daily brief. Often the director, if he's there or she's there, will bring in other analysts who will give more backstory to the president. And then what's supposed to happen is, okay, we've just told you the way things are, goodbye. And they leave the room. And then the policymakers figure out what to do with this information. Unfortunately, it's the dividing line is never quite as clean as that, and often the CIA can get dragged into a policy where they're asked, hey, can you give us more intelligence that conforms to this policy that we want to do, and that's what happened in Iraq. What's happened in the Trump administration, it's an altogether different thing. The national intelligence estimate we're talking about here was about Russia's interference in the upcoming election in 2020. And so the usual analysts, from all these different agencies got to work. And by July, they came up with a rough draft. And these NIEs begin with these key judgments. It's basically a way of saying, here's the bottom line at the very top. Here's the executive summary. And the key judgments were about 3 or 4. And key judgment number 2 said, basically, Russia prefers the current president. This should not be a surprise. Russia preferred Donald Trump in 2016. The intelligence community has a consensus opinion of that. Putin said so himself, standing next to President Trump in 2018 in Helsinki. And there's plenty of evidence, open source evidence, in addition to what you dig for, to indicate that Trump still, or that Putin still wants Trump to be president. So it shouldn't have been that big a deal, shouldn't have been controversial at all. It is, however. The reason it is because what people in the West Wing and what people in the intelligence community all came to learn, oftentimes the hard way, is that President Trump, when he receives this information, hey, Russia is going to interfere again, and they're going to interfere with the goal of getting you reelected, he receives that as if people are calling into question the legitimacy of his presidency. And so he has pushed back on that. And you guys have heard this. I mean, this is in a way, the beauty of, if I could say, of this president, that, I mean, he says the quiet part out loud. he has said, look, for all we know, it's not Russia, it's some fat guy, and is, sitting in his grandmother's bed in the basement. Or he said, we think China did it. It's, he's shown, in public how much he resists the intelligence community's consensus opinion on this. But in fact, because this key judgment, which would have seemed so innocuous, was so controversial, and there was already all this emotional riptide about it in the West Wing, that the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates, was asked to change it, to modify it. And he refused to do so. He was going to stick with the analysts. About 10 days after he refused to do so, he was fired. Ultimately, he was replaced by an acting director. And before the acting director really got his feet wet, ultimately that assessment, that key judgment, was modified, and it was softened in what seemed like a really sort of vanilla way. It went from Russia favors the current president to Russia probably assesses that relations with the U.S. will be endangered under a different president. So it was kind of the obverse of it. But basically, it was a distinction with a difference, because it meant that then Trump and others could say, hey, the intelligence community has never said that Russia prefers me. I don't know what you're talking about. And in fact, when, as I say in my story, several months after this NIE was altered, an intelligence official testified in a classified House hearing that, yeah, Russia prefers Trump. Trump heard about this, went ballistic, and fired the acting director, Joe Maguire. So all of which is to say that 2 directors were fired for simply backing up the analytic assessment that Russia prefers him. This is politicization. And it didn't happen this way under the Bush administration. Bush may not have liked certain intelligence, but he never went around firing people because of it. So we have reached a different watermark in the Trump administration when it comes to the intelligence community.
Super, thank you. I'm trying to decide, David, do I have a little bit more time, or are we done? Should we stop? Keep going. Okay, thank you. I was going to ask you if you saw this as radically different from the way previous presidents have used intelligence or misused it or ignored it or whatever. Clearly it is. How do you see this affecting our alliances and sort of our international policy, given that he's not a great listener to anything?
Sure. So let me actually first take the first part and just say quickly that, intelligence is often inconvenient. Truth is inconvenient. I mean, in the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the CIA, the Director of National Intelligence, often told the president what they didn't want to hear, and it would sort of minimize the president's decision space. And for this president, just to take a kind of innocuous example, as is famously known, the president doesn't like NATO. He wants to get out of NATO. And the CIA would brief him and say, here are the second and third order consequences that could happen if we get out of NATO, and those consequences are bad. Very typically, a president would say, oh, well, thanks a crapload. And, but they would just deal with the world as it is and go forward. What this president said when that was said to him was, you're not helping me. You're not being helpful here. You're not being supportive of me. And so now to your question of what does this do with our alliances? We have what are called liaisons, foreign liaisons of other intelligence units throughout the world. So consider this president who, Margaret, as you said, has a kind of short attention span, doesn't read much at all, and doesn't listen for very long. But it's worse than that. It's that he has loose lips. He's kind of a gossip. He likes to likes to impress his rich businessmen friends on the phone. And so there is one NATO ally, for example, whose director of intelligence had basically advised his intelligence officers not to do business with our intelligence people on particular subjects, mainly dealing with Russia, for fear that when President Trump is ultimately briefed on it, that he'll spill the beans to the Russians. So this is a real problem, and as to what the solution is, as to whether a new president just kind of flips the switch and we're back to normal, that is, that's another topic. But that is where we are today.
Okay. Wow. Thank you, I guess. What concerned you most as you were developing the article?
Well, what concerned me is that, I mean, there are a lot of people, like case officers like you were, Margaret, and analysts who are still just kind of putting their heads down and doing work. But there are others who are heading for the exits. They believe their own work has been compromised a couple of tiers above them. I mean, when you turn in honest work and then you've got, so just to take an example, in the Department of Homeland Security, it has now come out in this whistleblower complaint that came out a couple of weeks ago, that there's something called a Homeland Threat Assessment that was made. And so yet again, there's something about Russia election security, and it says quite clearly that Russia is the main danger vis-a-vis our election security, not China. The acting secretary of DHS, Chad Wolf, has been sitting on that assessment. He doesn't want to have it out there. And according to the whistleblower complaint, it's because it would politically embarrass the president. So this has been, I mean, the troubling thing is that now it is truly affecting the product. And, that it's not just a hassle. It's not just something they have to deal with. It's the work that they do is being compromised. That's what I found most troubling.
Is that the biggest takeaway, do you think, from the piece?
I do. I mean, I think that there's a lot in the piece that's quite alarming about the president, how he receives intelligence, how he doesn't, how the eggshells that people in the intelligence community have to walk around. But I think finally, where the rubber meets the road is if the product that goes out. So, since right around the time that my story was published, the director of national intelligence, election security guy, this guy, William Evanina, has put out these statements saying, yeah, Russia does prefer the president, but China prefers Biden. Iran prefers Biden, and has made it sound like, well, it's kind of a mishmash, sort of a jump ball. If anything, two countries favor Biden while one favors Trump. So maybe it's advantage Biden. But that is such a mudding of the waters to compare what Iran is doing with their very meager influence campaign, to compare with China, which is basically just, playing within the system, is actually trying to get legislation passed, is, hiring lobbyists, to compare that with Russia. And with Russia's actual attempts to hack into our infrastructure, to create disinformation, to suppress the vote, is total apples and oranges. But it is what now our senior intelligence officials are pumping out for the American public to hear.
Any way to counter it?
I mean, no. I mean, it's certainly, the journalists and the House Intelligence and Senate Intelligence Committees have done their level best to try to expose this. But it's a problem when, for example, with the upcoming election, it's important, to send a signal to the public that don't believe everything you're reading on Facebook, because a lot of this is disinformation being put out by the Russians. Well, the president has a real bully pulpit. He'd be the guy to broadcast that information, but he's not going to do it. And now he's got his own senior intelligence officials walking around scared about saying the same thing themselves.
Does anybody see is there a way to get the unbiased intelligence assessment in front of like Adam Schiff or somebody like that? He's
seen some of the raw intelligence. He's seen some of the analytical products. But what he told me was he is concerned that not only the products themselves, but also even the classified closed door testimony that he's receiving is now being compromised. That people are so afraid that what they say will get leaked out, that the president will get upset, that they will suffer death by Twitter, that that they will be fired, their careers will be ruined, that they will get death threats. These are not, crazy fears. These are not unfounded.
Are the people who read the finished intelligence products, are they allowed to see the underlying intelligence? Like Devin Nunes, for instance?
It depends. They can request it, but they do not have, let's say, subpoena power over raw intelligence. They can't do. But he certainly, I mean, Devin Nunes, who's the ranking minority leader of the House Intelligence Committee, I mean, certainly has access to a lot of classified information. That national intelligence estimate that I've described to you, he certainly has had access to read in total. It includes sourcing and all of that. So yeah, he does. I mean, and Trump, and of course, Schiff, the chairman, does too. Trump is really worried because he believes that Schiff is leaking things, that his staff is leaking things to politically embarrass him. But this whole notion that Russia favors the current president was not leaked by Schiff. That only actually came about after Trump fired the acting director, Joe Maguire, and then an explanation was required as to why he did so. And it was because his senior intelligence official, Shelby Pearson, in a classified hearing, had said that Russia prefers Trump, and he didn't like that.
So it got out even.
Yeah, it got out, but it was only because if he hadn't fired anyone, I mean, we wouldn't know to this day that the testimony even took place. A week beforehand, this woman gave the very same testimony to the Senate Intelligence Committee, but that committee happens to be much less partisan, and the two sides work together. And so the details of that, I mean, I've since learned that the details were very much in keeping with what the members of the House Intelligence Committee heard, but I mean, it didn't leak out, so it's and nobody got fired.
Yeah. Just two quick more. Mm-hmm. Can the IC be put back together, do you think?
Yes, I do.
How?
I mean, I think that it's not going to be an overnight proposition for a new president, or for that matter, this president with having a sudden awakening, sending the signal to the intelligence community that that the intelligence itself is a sovereign state, and that whether it's appreciated or not, whether it's followed or not, it will never be altered, and that is simply not happening. The President Trump has made explicitly clear, again, I mean, he has said this, for the record in public, that he knows more than the general does, that he believes Putin more than he believed the deputy or the director of national intelligence, Dan Coates. And so that basically, and whenever the intelligence community differs with him, he falls back and says, yeah, you're the same geniuses who said that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And in fact, the analytic community, I think, has reformed itself and has learned a lot from that very egregious error then. But Trump continues to fall back on that. And so internally, there have been reforms. Restoring credibility to it is something that's going to require major effort by either, again, another president or this president somehow coming to Jesus on this.
I don't know how to ask this delicately, Robert, that I'm sure will shock you. Is there any sense, do you have a sense that perhaps Trump's fascination with Putin, or whatever it is, has some effect on the intelligence community's response to him?
Well, I mean, actually, yes and no. I mean, it is true that the intelligence community has now come to recognize what is of interest to the president, and they are pumping out intelligence accordingly. And what's not of interest to the president is Russia's interfering in the election. They are managing to continue to do that, particularly in the Department of Homeland Security, in spite of the president, not because of him. But I do not think that that thus far that there have been new analytic judgments that are just saying something that isn't true. In fact, the Washington Post put out a story, I believe it was this morning or last night, basically saying that a new CIA assessment is that Russia is denigrating Biden. So obviously to favor Trump.
Oh, David, there you are. Am I supposed to turn over to you?
Well, we could open this up more.
Let's do that.
I got a couple of good questions, and actually here's one for both of you. This is from William Watson. It said, should the CIA continue to be located bureaucratically in the executive branch? those in the executive branch, especially in CIA leadership, quote, serve at the pleasure of the president and therefore cannot remain apolitical and unbiased if they want to be part of the decision-making process. Witness, Robert, your description of the firings of the two most recent. So the question is, should the CIA be independent, which would allow its leadership to finally tell truth to power without political repercussions? And the flip side of that, he notes a little bit later, is that if they're in a situation like now, they're losing their relevance in terms of the intelligence. So how do you guys both think about that? Should CIA become more independent outside the executive branch, not under the leadership of the president?
Well, I mean, that's Mr. Watson, Margaret. I think you know this fellow. It's Jerry Watson, a remarkable analyst, retired analyst from the CIA. And I think the question as phrased answers itself. I mean, it's that there is a lot to be said for making it independent to the extent that it is that it does not have to answer to politics. I do not know what that would look like, and as I'm like trying to think through the unintended consequences of that, I mean, it is at the moment, the case where a president appoints his or her director of intelligence and both director of national intelligence and director of the CIA. And it's not clear to me if under what Jerry is describing, that would cease to be the case, which then could be concerning because after all, let's face it, a lot of reforms took place in the wake of the abuses, in the 1960s and 1970s. The so-called Church Commission was set up to investigate these serious abuses. And so the notion of an autonomous CIA that is not politically answerable brings with it concerns of its own. So it's a bit wishy-washy. Margaret, do you have a...
Yeah, totally wishy-washy.
Yeah.
I would say that seems to me to be making a bureaucratic solution into what is a personality type problem. CIA doesn't have decision-making power or capability or responsibility. The CIA just says, here's what's there. We've talked about this before, Robert, where the job is to just provide the truth as close as you can get to it. And if the director, who will remain nameless in the case that I'm thinking in Iraq, for instance, doesn't stand up the way the director should, it doesn't matter where you put the entity, I would say. I think it's a little bit, and this is going to get me in trouble with, I know at least one person in the audience. When the ODNI was set up, it was...
What is that? What's the ODNI?
Sorry.
The Office of the Directorate of National Intelligence, which was set up in 2004 because before then, the director of the CIA was basically the director overseeing all the agencies. So it was a bit of a conflict of interest. Go ahead, Margaret.
Thanks, Robert. He's the English to English translator. When it was set up, it was supposed to do X, but it turned into this gigantic sort of blob-like amoeba thing that impaired your ability to do anything, at least from the field. And I was in a good, friendly country, but it was still a nightmare. I'm imagining it's gotten a little better, but that seemed to me at the time to be a bureaucratic solution to something that could have been avoided with like a 1 or 2 person jigger. So I would say the agency doesn't have decision-making a role. All we had was an information role. So it doesn't really, the person's still going to be accountable to somebody unless he or she is the equivalent of the president. So I'm not sure that would make a difference. Was that less wishy-washy?
Let me ask an extension of that question, because it has to do with how presidents deal with the community. So here's a chat from Fahim Sinha. Is there a long-term concern within the intelligence community that the intelligence product will be further polarized by future presidents who will take example from the Trump presidency?
Yeah, sure, of course. First let's stipulate that regardless of whether or not the president is reelected, Trumpism is likely to outlast him. That now that we live in this world, and it's very much a world, if not of Trump's creating, then of his, let's say, accelerating or exacerbating or whatever, of news, fake news, alternative facts, etc., then the very notion of intelligence being cooked up to feed to help buttress a president's agenda is a real concern, where that was the kind of thing that was unheard of in any previous administration. Yeah, for sure, it's a concern.
And just for a small plug for Robert's book, which I thought was fabulous and which we won't talk about in depth, I promise. He makes a really, really compelling argument, I think, for the way the administration wanted things to be, and the fact that if you had left somebody out of it who will also remain nameless, it wouldn't have been that way. I mean, it wasn't the same thing, I would say. Wouldn't you agree?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yep. Yeah.
So this is new and bad.
Yeah.
And the Senate doesn't help.
Why not? What do you mean?
Robert, don't you think the senators on the SSCI I'm sorry, Senate Select Committee on Oversight of Intelligence?
Yeah, Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, right. Yeah. No, they're meant to be, so that the two intelligence committees in the House and the Senate are the ones who are the oversight committees for the intelligence community. They receive this information. They have top security clearance to read it in the way that others on the Hill do not. And the truth is this, we're grading on a curve here. The Senate Intelligence Committee is so much more grown up and so much more likely to see things through a consensus viewpoint. Then again, I may be speaking prematurely, because that was the case when the committee chairman was the Republican Richard Burr. He has stepped down now. Marco Rubio is a different kettle of fish. So we'll see. We'll see if he works alongside the Democrats with a level of comedy that we've expected in the past.
Here's a kind of question about the law from Alexa O'Brien. Do U.S. intel practitioners have a statutory duty to warn Congress about certain threats, like pandemics or other threats?
Well, strictly speaking, no. It's not as if they are required. If they read some piece of intelligence and wash it through the analytical process, they're not required by law to go do that. I mean, they are required to be responsive. They give briefings. And it's probably a distinction without a difference, but the process doesn't work as like, wow, I'm reading this and I am legally bound to show it to them. They're legally bound to be responsive to requests from their oversight committees and from the executive branch anyway.
Here's another one, and I know many of faculty, both at McCormack and the College of Management and elsewhere on campus, are concerned about organizational management, et cetera. So here's a question that'll be great for both of you. Robert, from looking on the outside in, communicating and talking and interviewing people, and Margaret, who was inside for a long time. How do senior career intelligence community officers maintain morale among field officers and analysts if they feel intel is being manipulated or distorted by the political appointees? Well,
that's a very poignant subject right now, and from and I know there are others in the audience from the intelligence community who are listening in, retired but still have a lot of friends who are inside, who can attest to this, that there is a great deal of discouragement. I mean, it's not that analysts are being interfered with per se. It's not like someone's getting called and saying, hey, this thing you're writing, this upcoming national intelligence assessment, I understand you're the lead author on it. Don't say X, Y, Z. That's not the way it's working. But it's recognizing that what they have collected from the field and or what they are analyzing at Langley and then producing now is in danger in a way that it never was before of not resembling the finished product. That of course has an effect on morale.
As for how you fix it, I have no idea. I think it would be extraordinarily difficult unless you wanted to sort of play the resistance. Everybody singing the Marseillaise or whatever our version of it would be, and try to encourage people to stay, wait it out, and do the right thing and see what happens. I have no idea. I'd have been fired by now if I were still there.
So here's a question. I think, Margaret, you touched on this a little bit when you were talking about dealing with other countries. So here's from Javier Martel. Do you think there's a long-term impact on the U.S. ability to share and receive sensitive intelligence information, as to some extent our ability to do so relies on a moral currency that seems to be no longer the legal tender it used to be?
I would say more than a moral or anything like that. You've got a guy who can't keep his mouth shut. So why would they share anything with us? We've already seen intelligence blown out of the water. I think it can't, I mean, Robert, I think it can't help but have an impact.
Yeah, I mean, I'll do this quickly. I mean, just and it's a reiteration of what I'd said before. That let's say if you're, a foreign intelligence source or something, then for one thing, I do not know. This is an abstraction thus far, or a hypothetical. But if you do not know that the intelligence that you provide, and that for that matter, your own safety is secure through the intelligence community, owing to the fact that the commander-in-chief is someone who can be very cavalier about information, who has in the Oval Office said things to Russian visitors that he should not, who has on Twitter posted stuff relating to Iran that he should not. I mean, as I say should not, the president, of course, has the right to declassify anything and everything, but it has ramifications, and surely those ramifications filter all the way to the bottom, all the way to the beginning of the collection of intelligence from a source.
If you're supposed to protect somebody, it's pretty hard to convince him of that when he's just seen something go out of a Twitter feed.
Here's a totally speculative question, and it's from Nigel Hamilton, who's a fellow here at McCormack and a quite well-known biographer, presidential biographer. And he says Russia favors Trump. We've established, the Intel Committee has established that. Does Russia control Trump possibly? And is the intelligence community able to examine this?
Yeah, the answer is, of course, it's possible. And yes, the intelligence community has examined it, but where the rubber meets the road, I think, what Nigel's referring to is in this climate, could a national intelligence estimate be produced that basically says, does Putin have something on President Trump? The question answers itself, given what if a national intelligence estimate that makes the kind of vanilla assessment that Russia prefers the current president is too much of a hot button issue, then I think we can, deduce from that that the president is hardly going to sit by idly and allow something like that to get cooked up. Now, I do not know, whether I do know that there was a national intelligence estimate that was written last year about Putin, but I think that it was more about, sort of the mind of Putin and what he's assessing about this. And I should say that there certainly is no conclusive evidence that anybody in the intelligence community has that Trump is doing Putin's bidding because Putin has something on Trump. That's not been established.
Margaret, any comments on that?
I'm just going to stay quiet for the sake of my pension.
Okay, here's a question from Associate Dean Kiki Adozi. She's the Associate Dean here at McCormack, also professor in conflict resolution, human security, and global governance. And she says, there's a new book out today, I think, concluding that Mueller wasn't up to the job in investigating the president after all. He didn't have the political gravitas. What do you think?
Well, I haven't read the book yet, but I've read things about it, and I think there had been a great concern that Mueller and one of his principal deputies were very concerned about any political blowback, and essentially, it's not so much that on an evidentiary level we're giving President Trump the benefit of the doubt, but that he was Mueller was very wary of what might happen if, for example, he were to say what this book apparently indicates was the conclusion that they had internally formed, which was that the president had, in fact, obstructed justice. That could have been plainly stated, and it was not. And so also, Mueller, according to this book, was of the belief that that Mueller had placed too much trust in his old friend, Attorney General Barr. And I don't think you need any analysis from me as to whether or not that trust was misplaced.
I think one other small piece, and I worked a little bit with Mr. Mueller, and he was terrific to work with. He was easy. Was when he was FBI director, and the FBI and CIA don't always get along. And you could call, or I could call him, I'm sure other people could too, and ask a favor, could he help us do something? And he never said no. And he would sort of do it if you asked him, he'd do it 10 minutes later. He was terrific. I just have a feeling that he's very by the book. He's very the way things should be done. And I'm not sure, I think it's a little bit maybe a case, without having read Mr. Weissman's book, a little bit of a case of what I think hinders us throughout the government still, which is using sort of traditional norms to deal with Trump. Are you having a disagreement, Robert?
No, I'm agreeing with you.
That they haven't yet figured out that he's the scorpion on the back of the alligator, and he keeps telling them he's not going to sting them, and inevitably they're gone. He trashed Mueller. Didn't matter what Mueller said. Although I also heard earlier that his concern was something about did we want to make the test for anything legal precedent, anything that involved Trump a legal precedent, because it was so far out of the norm. I don't know that I just said an English sentence, but I think I know what I.
So here's a kind of high-level philosophical question. I really like it because you know, I've been thinking a lot about, my expertise is climate change, and we know questions about truth about that. Clearly people, when we look at what's been happening with the COVID virus, there are questions about truth and trust of science, et cetera. So this is a question from Rob Stevenson. It says, I think this is a part of a deeper problem of how societies build consensus. Science is a way of knowing that has caused a divide in society. I see it as just another example of the rejection of climate change, genetically engineered crops, vaccination, et cetera. How do you see that? You guys are ensconced in the intelligence field, but that's a way of knowing in the same way that scientific research is and epidemiology, et cetera. How do you?
I think they're of a piece. I think they're inseparable, in fact. And you know, people will remember that Donald Trump, when he ran for president in 2015, was saying, you know, that you guys, all of you other, you know, Republican opponents, all believe the stuff about, you know, Saddam having WMD, you all supported this stupid endless war. But and more or less the same breath, it was also talking about, you know, climate change, it will all go away. And he was essentially inviting people to dismiss expertise altogether and instead wed themselves to the belief system of Donald, I alone can fix it, Trump. And so I do agree that all of this precedes Trump. I mean, there had already been lots of, you know, questions relating to climate change, for example, and Democrats, you know, sometimes with their over-the-top pronouncements about climate change have facilitated that unwittingly. But it's all part of this bigger piece now of being able to select information that's convenient to your way of life. And, you know, I was talking the other day to somebody about, you know, when I was a kid, and this dates me, you know, that when seatbelts were, you know, mandated by law, and that was an inconvenience. But back in those days, if you know, even though it was Ralph Nader, I mean, if consumer studies indicated that this was important, people basically fell in line. But these days there would be a counterweight to that. There'd be this whole argument of no, that doesn't really do it. You know, all it does is impinge on your individual freedoms. I mean, we're seeing this play out with the masks, obviously.
I think another piece of it is that, and I don't know how this started, but we started believing that science didn't work when TV and film personalities told us it didn't work. Like when Jenny McCarthy became the voice of should you vaccinate your child, that was sort of stunning, and yet she's had an enormous impact. Or when we stopped, and my bias comes on this one from my father and a dear friend, that all nuclear power was bad because of 2 movies, Jane Fonda. I love Jane Fonda, but I just don't take that as like the expertise. So I think this is a little older. I mean, I'm even older than Robert, so maybe it goes back to that. I just think that we started down this path years ago where science didn't mean anything.
So, okay, we have a little less than 5 minutes.
Oh, sorry.
And let's say that you were able to advise either incoming President Biden or staying President Trump. Given what you know, what would be your 2-minute pitch to either of them on how to make this intelligence system work better?
To me, this is an incredibly banal thing to say, but I'll say it anyway, which is that the pursuit of the truth matters. And it's something to say to incoming President Biden as well, because after all, I don't think that though, Joe Biden was by no means, in my view, one of the villains of the whole Iraq saga. It's nonetheless the case that he accepted the conventional wisdom that Saddam had weapons. He called Saddam on September the 10th, 2001, a homicidal maniac. And when you say that kind of thing, it gives you permission not to even deal with the guy, not to even consider anything other than he's, this big evildoer. But so the pursuit of truth is, and the failure to do so is what led to the Iraq War. I'm not convinced that I could get this into President Trump's head, but I would say, just as those around him who have in fact been marginalized or fired have said, which is that, the truth is not your enemy. It may be an inconvenience to you, but if you're ultimately surrounded only by people who tell you what you wish to hear, then you live in a bubble that does not prevent you, or that does not permit you to understand the world when it's absolutely necessary to do so. The coronavirus being a case in point. There was a moment in time where finally he had to understand that we had this horrible virus that was coming from China, spreading throughout the world and spreading into the United States, and that it was airborne, and that it was not just going to go away. And it went against the president's instincts to embrace that, as horrific as it might be. Just as it went against his instincts to do what he could have done, which is to own the fact that Russia interfered in 2016 and say, you know what, we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. So I would say, whether it would fall on deaf ears or not, that you have to pursue, and you have to trust and embrace the truth. You can veer away from it if you wish, but if you banish it altogether, then you're left with a vacuum that's only filled by the imagination and your own political preferences.
Margaret, you get the last word.
Cool. Mine was going to be a lot more sort of bones and the structure. If you want to put it back together, you're going to have to hire back some of the people who left out of frustration. You're going to have to get some serious experts, and you're going to have to work against things like the Iraq War disaster, which I would do with different promotion systems and everything else under the sun. I think it's probably doable. I don't think there's a point in talking to President Trump. I don't think it's that he doesn't understand. I think Robert's a kind soul. He doesn't care. According to what he said to Woodward, he knew, but he doesn't care. And I think that's the problem. And I guess that's where I would differentiate between Biden and Trump, where Biden certainly says political things that you sort of, if you're a fan of his, you wish you wouldn't say, but I do think he cares. I think Trump doesn't care about anything unless it's going to make him some money. And I'm not even certain that he understands that the entire US government is not transactional, and that all those analysts aren't making money on some sort of secret stuff that they know. Like, I don't know, Kelly Loeffler maybe. So I would sort of say the basics would be hire back people who really know the business and protect them.
Great. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Robert. We're at the end of the hour. This has been a fantastic conversation. We've covered a lot of territory deeply. I apologize for those of you whose questions we didn't get to. There were about more than twice as many questions that we had time for. They were fantastic. Really appreciate it. And again, thank you for the work that historically you have done, Margaret. Thank you for your public service. Robert, thank you for your service in the media. And really appreciate how you guys are really driving these conversations. And thank you to my brother, Steve, who raised this with me 5 weeks ago. This has been a great panel and a really fantastic conversation. So thank you, everybody. And thanks, Rochelle and Jack, for making it all work. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Robert.
Bye-bye. Maybe some ice cream, Margaret.
Yes, sir. Caramel coming up.
Excellent. Great. Thanks.